Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the European theater. This is the war in Europe that took place from 1939 until 1945. This war will consume most of the continent of Europe and will be one of the bloodiest and deadliest conflicts ever fought in human history. So the Second World War really begins when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in August of 1939. What this non-aggression pact does is basically say they are not going to attack each other, and this gives Hitler a green light for war. This means that he and Nazi Germany will not have to fight a two-front war like they had in the First World War. They will not have to fight Russia and the Western Allies. They will just have to fight against France and Great Britain in the idea of a war. So this kind of gives Hitler the green light to start a war. So a month later, in September 1939, German forces cross the Polish border and invade Poland under false pretenses. This is the official start of World War II. Once Germany has entered Poland and began war on Poland, Britain and France declare war against Germany. Several weeks after German forces cross Poland, the Soviet Union, Germany's ally, invades from Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union and Germany split Poland down the middle. There's actually a lull in the war in a period known as the Phony War from the invasion of Poland through the winter until the spring of 1940. In the spring of 1940, Hitler's German army uses blitzkrieg tactics to quickly overtake Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France. So these countries fall in Western Europe, and you can see here Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris after the sacking of Paris. So most of the European continent is now split between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The only hope for the European continent is Great Britain, which is on an island off the coast of France, and they enter into what's known as the Battle of Britain. So Nazi forces began a massive bombing campaign in 1940 to try to cripple the will of the British public and their fighting power. 23,000 British civilians are killed in these bombing raids that target civilian centers. But Winston Churchill, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this period, actually heroically leads his country through this and kind of sets the example of British resolve that Britain is going to maintain. They are going to keep on fighting. They are going to stay in this, and they will get through these bombings. In spring of 1941, Hitler betrays his alliance with the Soviet Union, and Nazi German forces invade the USSR. So what Hitler hopes to do is quickly overrun the Soviet Union using blitzkrieg tactics, which have proved so effective in Western Europe. And he wanted to overtake the USSR, claim the oil reserves it had, and then force Britain out of the war using bombers and submarines. So again, fighting the Battle of Britain, but they hope to take out the Soviet Union, so pretty much the entire continent of Europe will belong to the Nazis. But what this Soviet offensive does is it opens up a massive front in Eastern Europe. This is a front line that stretched 1,600 miles in length. So the German offensive actually stalls out because this is so massive, and they begin to run out of supplies as the Russian winter sets in. So they get bogged down in mud and snow, and they cannot overcome the terrain, the winter, or the Soviet people. So the idea of a quick lightning victory in the Soviet Union proves elusive due to the size of the country and the nature of the terrain. The German army is also met by Soviet citizens and Soviet forces that were all in. So the Soviet Union mobilizes millions upon millions of people to fight this German offensive, often unequipped, but a lot of times these Soviets are fighting obviously for life and death. They're fighting against the harsh tactics of the Germans, and they are willing to sacrifice everything in their fight against the Germans. As a result of this, the Soviet Union probably suffers more than any other power in World War II. 27 million Soviets died in the Second World War, from famine, from combat, from a whole variety of aspects involving war, but the Soviet Union really sacrifices a lot in fighting Nazi Germany. The most decisive and destructive battle in the Soviet front is the Battle of Stalingrad, and this is really a turning point against the German forces. And this shows how willing the Soviet Union is to sacrifice their people and to fight to the extreme. So what they do is allow the city of Stalingrad to be taken with its citizens inside. The Soviet army leaves the city, allows German forces to move in, and then circles the city with all the Soviet citizens in there. But what this does is it stops the German advance and kept them from securing oil fields in the south of the Soviet Union. The fighting in Stalingrad is incredibly vicious. It is hand-to-hand urban combat, and it is terrible. There are massive casualty rates as a result of this. It is a 7-month battle in the streets and rubble of Stalingrad. Only 91,000 of the 500,000 Soviet troops survived the battle. Only 5,000 German soldiers of the 300,000 in the final battle returned to Germany. So that's such a small number. And you see the suffering here. You see a woman carrying the body of her child in the city. Again, the Soviet Union left the city for the Germans to take and then enclosed on the Germans. So the people are left there. So there's starvation. It's in the Russian winter. It is just a horrible, horrible battle. But the Soviets do overcome the Germans. But what they're left with is the complete destruction of Stalingrad. The amount of casualties, the amount of destruction in the city because of combat is terrific. You can see here the depiction of just a burned down factory of German troops inside of Stalingrad. So it is one of the worst battles of the Second World War. And so while Stalingrad is the most significant and devastating battle of the Soviet war, you can see just how hard it was for the Soviet citizens in the 900-day siege in Leningrad. So this is a siege that lasts for almost 3 years. Leningrad is now known as St. Petersburg. It was known as St. Petersburg. Then it became Leningrad, and now it's St. Petersburg again. It's in northern Russia. But what the Germans do is lay siege to the city. They do not invade the city like they do in Stalingrad. But what happens is the people who are left in the city don't have supplies for almost 3 years. So they're left fending for themselves. So you see people dragging a dead body through the streets. And you also see young boys getting water out of a drainage ditch. So they don't have any supplies in the city. So the people of Russia are really sacrificing. And that's what you have to remember, is this the ultimate sacrifice that these people made. So several months after the Nazis have invaded the Soviet Union, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and draw the United States into the Second World War. But what happens is the United States realizes that if it uses its military might, it should be able to easily defeat Japan, that it should be able to push Japan back. And what they do with their allies, now the Soviet Union and Great Britain, they make what is known as the ABC-1 agreement, which says that they should focus on defeating Hitler first. That it's going to be much more difficult to defeat Nazi Germany, to overtake the continent of Europe again. And so what the Americans commit to is the idea of, let's try to defeat Hitler before we defeat Japan. So in their effort to defeat Hitler first, British and American forces focus on defeating Italian and German forces in North Africa from 1940 to 1943. They're able to do that, force the Italians and Germans out of Egypt and Libya. And you can see that depiction there. You can see an American transporter flying over the pyramids in Egypt. You can see the desert warfare with the tanks and the infantry in the desert. And this is where some major tank warfare happens in the Second World War, but the British and Americans are able to win against the Italians and Germans. From North Africa, the American and British forces begin to strike at Italy. This is known as the Italian Campaign and begins in 1943. The Americans and the British land on Sicily, an island off the coast of Italy. And what they're trying to do, in Winston Churchill's words, is strike at the soft underbelly of Europe. They believe that they can come through Italy and it will be easier to attack than through fortified France. They eventually, as they're pushing into Italy, fascist forces overthrow Mussolini. And these forces declare a truce with the Allies in September of 1943. So Italy is effectively out of the Second World War. But the entire time this is happening, the Soviets are asking the Allied forces to open up a second front in France. The Soviets are suffering greatly in their battle against Nazi Germany. And so the plan is eventually to launch a massive offensive from Great Britain into France. And What this will do is open up a second front, and this will hopefully cripple Nazi Germany. So on June 6, 1944, in what is known as D-Day, British, Canadian, and American forces cross the English Channel and invade Nazi-occupied France. Once they've landed on the beach and they are able to take the beach and maintain it, this is the beginning of the end for Hitler, as he will now have to fight a two-front war. Dwight Eisenhower is the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe in the lead up to the D-Day invasion and following. So Eisenhower is an American general, but he is leading all the Allied forces together. Eisenhower will go on to become President of the United States, but he plans this operation known as Operation Overlord. That is the D-Day operation to land in France in near the area of Normandy. D-Day is the largest amphibious invasion in human history. So on June 6, 1944, 5,333 Allied ships and landing crafts bring nearly 175,000 men to the shores of France from Great Britain. So you can see there on the left, that is what's known as a Higgins boat. So that boat goes to the shore, opens up, and men unload onto the beach. Then you can see the day after D-Day, as all the massive troop supports have landed, there's blimps in the air, and the Allied forces have taken the beachhead. The fighting on the beaches in Normandy is incredibly bloody, in particular for the Americans who land on Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach is actually a cliffed area, so they meet embedded German forces who have a higher ground, and they're unloading on a beach, so there's really nowhere to hide. It's incredibly bloody fighting, but the massive force does overtake the Germans, and they're able to gain a hold of the beach, and they are able to begin the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. So months later, as Allied forces are moving through France, the Germans launch a massive offensive, and this is basically their last strike. This is their last chance, and this will be known as the Battle of the Bulge. They strike Allied forces in the Belgian-French border in the Ardennes forest, basically where the Germans had invaded France originally. But the Allied forces are able to overcome this offensive, and this is kind of like the last gasp of the Nazi effort. The Americans will now push forward. The Allies will be able to push forward following the Battle of the Bulge. As a result of D-Day and the massive Allied offensive, France is liberated from Nazi control. So from 1940 until 1944, France is under control of the Germans and under the Nazi Party. And so you can see here these American soldiers who have liberated France. You can see them drinking French wine, and then you can see soldiers walking in front of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. So it is a huge victory for those people of France to be liberated from the Nazis. Now that France has been liberated and Allied forces have a secure base inside of Europe, they begin to focus their attention on destroying Germany. So what they do is start launching massive bombing raids out of Great Britain and out of France into the German homeland. As they did in Japan, Allied bombing raids focus on industrial areas and civilian centers. So what they're trying to do is destroy the ability to make war, but also destroy the ability of the people to fight. And so there are massive casualties from these bombing raids. This is a picture of a German lady looks for her children among a pile of dead school kids. 50,000 German civilians are killed, and 2.7 tons of bombs are dropped on Germany. So massive, massive bombing campaign to try to end the German will to fight. Maybe the most devastating aspect of the strategic bombing campaign is the bombing of Dresden, which is a city in northern Germany. Allied forces focused on the city to try to destroy the German ability to fight the war, and 70% of the city is destroyed. You can see the destruction of the city in this aerial picture taken here. 150,000 people are killed in the city during 2 nights of bombing. So the amount of firepower dropped on the city is absolutely massive. So the German people during this campaign are suffering greatly from the cost of war. They're being killed by bombs, obviously, but they're also suffering because of the conditions in the country. There's severe rationing in the country. There are not many supplies to go around as the country is at the end. The Americans and the Allied forces are pushing in from Western Europe. The Soviet forces are now pushing them back from Eastern Europe. So there's severe rationing in place. There's no toilet paper available throughout the country. People are given 250 grams of meat per week, which is about 0.5 pounds, so about a half-pound cheeseburger a week. And to the most extreme, people slaughtered zoo animals to eat for consumption. So Germans are really suffering in 1944 and 1945 as the war is closing in on them. So the German people are greatly suffering on the German home front. You have to think all the men have been conscripted into the army. They've fought for years and years. And so German children are forced to labor in the fields and factories to provide for the war effort. Germans are also using foreigners almost as slaves in German factories. They're also using foreigners as troops to fight the war. So they are being forced into extreme efforts and to mobilize their entire country as a part of this war effort. So as the Allies and the Soviets begin to close in on Germany, the German home front is tested even more. So in these extreme cases, you can see this with this quote here: "The Fuhrer expects your sacrifice for army and home guard, so that your home guard man can show himself in uniform. Empty your wardrobe and bring its contents to us." So what the Germans are saying is, give us your stuff. We need everything we can get. We are fighting the last bit. We need to guard our homeland. So it doesn't matter. We're going to take everything from you. So you can see the extreme measures that are happening in Germany as the war is beginning to come to an end. In need of military men, in need of fighting forces, the Germans begin to use the Hitler Youth, young boys and teenagers, to fight the war. The idea is that these boys are going to defend the homeland as Allied and Soviet forces get closer into Germany. So the men have been out fighting for years again, so they're going to use teenagers and young boys to defend the German homeland. As the Americans begin to enter into Germany, they are led by General George Patton. Patton leads the tank divisions and the entire U.S. Army into Germany. So as they get into 1945, the American forces start to close in, enter into Germany. At the same time, Soviet forces are entering Germany in the east. So it is really the end for Germany. As these forces come into Germany, close into German areas, the shocking realities of the war become apparent. Germans must deal with the shocking horrors of concentration camps. Allied forces and Soviet forces are liberating concentration camps. They're coming on these massive camps where millions of people have been killed, and kind of realizing the horror of the Holocaust. So what you see here is a depiction of a concentration camp, Schwabenmünchen, which was about to be liberated, and Nazi forces burned 4,000 people to death right as they were about to be liberated. So you can see the mass grave here. And so this is really the horrors of the war become apparent as these forces are closing in on Germany. In April of 1945, Soviet forces begin to invade Berlin, the German capital, to the east. American forces, Allied forces, are laying siege to Berlin at the same time. And so what has happened is the Nazi leadership is in a series of bunkers below Berlin, and Adolf Hitler kills himself as the Soviets are overtaking Berlin. And this effectively ends the war in Europe. So on May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe ends in what is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The Soviets have overtaken Berlin. The American forces have started to move in. Hitler has killed himself. Nazi Germany surrenders. And so this is the end of that horrible war in Europe.